Solomon the Dominant, the unspoken labor. The historical narrative of the First Temple in Jerusalem is often presented as a triumph of thousands of human laborers, skilled masons, and architects working in perfect synchronization to build a house for the divine. Yet, in the deeper, more esoteric transmissions of the sovereign protocol, the truth is far more complex and imposing. The building of the temple was not merely a project. It was a cosmic event that required the bridging of two worlds. Solomon the Dominant understood that to manifest a structure of such immense spiritual weight, he could not rely solely on the biological limitations of men who were bound by the constraints of the physical matrix. Human hands were too slow, human hearts were too easily corrupted by fatigue, and human spirits lacked the ancient memory required to shape the very foundations of reality. Solomon realized that the true builders of the monumental era had to be the ancient forces of the underworld themselves. He looked into the abyss not with fear, but with the cold, calculating eye of a master architect who recognized that the entities of the Goetia were essentially high-voltage power sources that had been allowed to operate in a state of unrefined chaos since the dawn of the simulation. This was the birth of the unspoken labor, the era where the darkness was forced to build the light, and where the 72 kings and presidents of the infernal hierarchy were turned into the construction crew of a single, dominant human consciousness. The dominance of Solomon was rooted in his realization of the human spirit. Once it reaches the 33rd degree of awareness, it becomes the natural administrator of all lower densities. He understood that the hierarchy of demons was not an external threat to be pleaded with, but a collection of specialized subatomic programs that governed the raw elements of the earth. These entities held the secrets of the stones, the temperaments of the metals and geometry, of the ley lines that crisscross the planet. To unlock the potential of Israel, Solomon had to exert a level of sovereign will that transcended traditional kingship. He bypassed the religions and the superstitions of his time to engage in a direct scientific application of spiritual law. By utilizing the legendary Rena device of vibrational synchronization, he was able to broadcast a command, signal that the demonic frequency could not resist. This was not a negotiation. It was a total takeover of the infernal infrastructure. The king transformed Jerusalem into a localized singularity where the chaos of the Goetia was compressed into the order of his vision. The demons, who had spent eons obstructing human evolution, were now the very instruments through which the structure was raised. Every stone that moved without a sound and every pillar that aligned with the stars was a testament to the fact that the architect had finally remembered how to command his own reflection. This introduction to the Solomon Protocol serves as the definitive blueprint for understanding the true nature of power. Most seekers fail because they attempt to destroy the shadow or ignore it today. But Solomon the Dominant taught that the sovereign must integrate and enslave the shadow. He proved that the darkness is only dangerous when it lacks a master. Within the context of the Tome of Knowledge, this labor represents the first major materialization of the impossible on a national scale. The abundance, the peace, and the legendary wisdom of Solomon's reign were not accidents of history. They were the secondary effects of a mind that had successfully bound the 72 most volatile forces in the universe. The construction site of the temple became a laboratory where the fire of the abyss was cooled and shaped into the solid gold of a golden age. This was the moment humanity was shown that the simulation could be rewritten if the observer possessed the internal density to withstand the pressure of the truth. Solomon walked among the spirits as their undisputed king, showing that the only thing standing between a man and the throne of a god is the willingness to assume absolute responsibility for the forces he invokes. As we move through this transmission, we explore the mechanical reality of how this enslavement was maintained through constant frequency. It was a process of constant vibrational maintenance, where Solomon's internal world had to remain more solid than the physical world surrounding him. If he had doubted his authority for a single second, the frequency of the seal would have collapsed, and the Legion of 72 would have torn his kingdom apart. This level of dominance required the king to live in a state of perpetual activation, his brain acting as the central processing unit for a workforce that existed across multiple dimensions. The unspoken labor was therefore a mental and spiritual feat as much as a physical one. It was the ultimate demonstration of the sovereign protocol, that the external world is a slave to the internal decree. The story of Solomon is the story of every architect who decides to be sovereign. They will no longer be a victim of the unseen forces of their own mind, choosing instead to bind their demons in the service of a grand, eternal vision. This is the foundation upon which all our work is built, the proof that the impossible is merely a task waiting for a master who is dominant enough to demand its completion. This marks the end of the transmission regarding the great king. Chapter 1. The Enslavement of the 72. The transition from a ruler of men to a sovereign of the unseen began at the exact moment Solomon realized that the architecture of the world is not held together by stone and mortar, but by the precise management of vibrational hierarchies. To build a temple that could act as a capacitor for the infinite, he required a workforce that existed outside the entropic decay of human biology. This realization led him to the threshold of the Great Summoning, a protocol designed to bypass the physical limitations of the matrix and tap directly into the primal energy sources of the abyss. Solomon understood that the 72 spirits of the Goetia were not mere mythological monsters to be feared or worshipped, but were in fact the raw, unrefined subatomic programs of life. To enslave them was not an act of religious fervor, but a technical necessity of the highest order. He stood at the center of the consecrated circle, not for protection, but as a broadcast tower of absolute sovereignty, holding the seal that resonated with the original frequency of the architect. This seal was the master key to the digital code of the universe, a device of great power. It allowed a single human consciousness to override the autonomous functions of the infernal legions and force them into a state of productive servitude. As the first names were spoken into the heavy silence of the ritual chamber, the air itself began to thicken with the resistance of the ancient spirits. Solomon did not flinch as the kings and presidents of the underworld came. They manifested in their various masks of terror, for he recognized that their appearance was merely a defensive software designed to repel the weak of heart. He looked past the fire and the shadows, seeing only the functional potential of the entities before him. He commanded them to surrender their individual wills and to merge their power with the grand vision of the temple building. This was the first time in the history of the simulation that the scattered forces of chaos were brought under a unified, dominant command. The enslavement was systematic and relentless. Solomon bypassed the ego of each spirit, binding them through the resonance of their own secret signatures. He realized that a demon is simply a high-voltage energy that has lost its grounding now. As the sovereign, he provided that grounding through the rigid structure of his decree. The spirits, who had spent eons obstructing the evolution of consciousness, were suddenly transformed into the most disciplined engineering crew the world had ever seen, their immense power finally harnessed toward the construction of the eternal. The labor that followed was a masterpiece of work. It was a masterpiece of supernatural coordination, as the 72 were assigned tasks that defied the known laws of physics. Solomon directed the legions to excavate the foundations of the earth, ordering the spirits of the earth to reveal the hidden geometry of the tectonic plates so that the temple would remain unshakable for 1,000 years. He utilized the demonic knowledge. He used their knowledge of mineralogy and alchemy to harden the stones and temper the metals to a degree that no human blacksmith could achieve. The construction site was a zone of absolute silence, for the spirits did not need to speak. They moved in perfect synchronization with the telepathic broadcast of the king's seal. Every block of granite and every beam of cedar was placed. Every beam was placed with a precision that mocked the efforts of mortal masons. Solomon sat upon his throne, eyes closed, acting as the central processing unit for a workforce that stretched across multiple dimensions. He felt the weight of every stone as if it were a thought in his own mind, and he felt the resistance of the demons as a friction that he continuously smoothed over. He smoothed it with the heat of his unwavering focus. The dominance he exerted was total, a constant pressure that assured the abyss remained in service to the light. As the walls of the temple began to rise, the surrounding nations watched in a state of paralysis, sensing that the power manifesting in Jerusalem was not of this world. Solomon had successfully integrated the shadow. He integrated it into the architecture of his kingdom, proving that the sovereign architect does not negotiate with the darkness, but organizes it into a structure of beauty and purpose. The enslavement of the 72 was the final proof of the 33rd degree, the demonstration that the human spirit, when fully activated, is the natural administrator of the matrix today. The spirits found themselves trapped in a grid of perfection, their chaotic nature neutralized by the overwhelming order of the work. They were forced to mine the gold of Ophir and the silver of Tarshish, bringing the wealth of the hidden world into the physical light to fund the expansion of the sovereign's vision. By the end of this phase, the temple was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing monument to the victory of the conscious mind over the ancient forces of entropy. Solomon had turned the architects of destruction into the builders of the divine, securing his place as the eternal master of the unseen and the primary legislator of the world's most profound transformation through the deep structural integration of these forces now. Solomon the Dominant began the process of vibrational interlocking. He realized that to maintain the enslavement of the 72, he could not merely command them through external force. He had to weave their very essence into the geometric configuration of the temple itself. He directed the spirits of the first rank to anchor their frequencies into the cornerstones of the area. This turned the physical foundation into a living, energetic circuit. This ensured that the more weight the building acquired, the more the demons were crushed into a state of absolute obedience. Every layer of masonry added to the structure acted as a physical seal, pressing down upon the chaotic impulses of the abyss and forcing them to stabilize into a frequency of pure utility. The construction site became a massive alchemy lab where the pride of kings like Paimon and the malice of dukes like Ageres were distilled into the silence of heavy basalt and the brilliance of polished gold. Solomon moved among the invisible laborers as a shadow master, his internal state so immovable that his mere presence caused the demonic entities to shiver and collapse. They collapsed into their assigned forms. As the expansion continued, the king focused on the extraction of hidden geometries, forcing the spirits to reveal the mathematical constants that govern the density of matter. He used this forbidden knowledge to make the temple stones lighter during transport and infinitely heavier once set in place, hacking the gravitational laws. This enabled the 72 to move monolithic blocks that would have taken generations of human labor to shift in a single afternoon. The dominance of Solomon was reflected in the eerie perfection of the work. There were no gaps, no errors, and no signs of human struggle. The demons were tasked with carving the interior reliefs where they were forced to engrave the seals. They engraved the seals that bound them into the cedar walls, creating a recursive loop of sovereignty that reinforced itself every time a prayer was whispered in the sanctuary. Solomon was not just building a house of worship. He was building a high-frequency trap for the darkness, ensuring that the most volatile spirits in existence were now the permanent batteries for Israel. The first chapter reaches its peak as Solomon began the consecration of the thresholds, where he bound the lesser spirits to the gates and windows of the temple to act as filters for the collective consciousness of the people. These entities were programmed to strip away the low-frequency vibrations of those who entered, ensuring that only the purified intent could reach them. This level of management proved that Solomon's dominance was not just about the construction of a building, but about the total administration of the energetic environment of his kingdom. By enslaving the 72, he had effectively taken control of the world's weather, its wealth, and its wisdom. The spirits were no longer independent agents of chaos, but were sub-processors. They were parts of a grander, more intelligent design. The king sat atop the growing structure, his mind a silent monolith that commanded the wind and the fire, watching as the First Legion completed the impossible foundation. He had successfully turned the masters of the pit into the servants of the throne, setting the stage for the final materialization of the divine blueprint. This led into the transmutation of infernal resistance, a critical phase where Solomon the Dominant addressed the psychic friction generated by 72 ancient egos being forced into a singular objective. He realized that the sheer hatred these entities held for the light could be harvested and compressed into a protective shield for the temple and the surrounding land. He commanded the spirits of the higher ranks to exhale their malice into the very mortar used to bind the stones. But before the substance could touch the rock, he passed it through the frequency of the seal, turning the energy of destruction into a frequency of impenetrability. This meant that the temple was not just physically solid, but energetically shielded for all time. It was protected against any external spiritual attack or cosmic interference. The demons were essentially forced to build a cage for themselves and a fortress for their master, using their own dark vitality as the raw material. Solomon stood at the center of this swirling energy, his biological field acting as the iron rod that grounded the lightning of the abyss in the world. He proved that a man who has mastered his own internal shadows becomes a vacuum that the external darkness is forced to fill and obey. As the structure reached toward the heavens, Solomon initiated the protocol of the celestial mirror, forcing the bound legion to align the roof of the sanctuary with the specific coordinates of the North Star and the belt of Orion above. The spirits, who possessed a memory of the stars from before the fall of man, were the only ones capable of such astronomical precision. They were forced to calculate the precession of the equinoxes and adjust the angle of every golden tile, so that at the exact moment of the solstice, the light would strike the Ark of the Covenant with the intensity of 1,000 bright suns. This was the moment the temple transitioned from a building into a stargate, a machine designed to bridge the dimensions. The demons labored in a state of agonizing awe, realizing that they were being used to re-establish the very connection to the divine that they had spent eons trying to sever. Solomon's dominance was now so absolute that he no longer needed to speak. The spirits responded to the rhythmic pulses of his heartbeat, which had become the metronome for the entire construction site. The expansion of this chapter concludes with the final sealing of the foundation rhythms, where Solomon forced the 72 to sing the Song of the Void in reverse. This inverted frequency acted as a metaphysical vacuum for the entire land. It sucked all discordant energy out of the land of Israel and trapped it within the resonance of the temple's basement. By doing this, he ensured that his kingdom would be a land of unprecedented mental clarity and physical health, for the demons of sickness and confusion were now busy holding up the heavy stones of the sanctuary. The king had turned the underworld power. He turned it into a massive subterranean power plant that fueled the golden age of his people. He stood upon the finished foundation, the ring glowing with a soft, predatory light, and looked down at the invisible laborers who were now forever part of the earth's crust. The first chapter of the great work was not merely finished. It was locked into the fabric of time itself. It remained a testament to the day a human mind became the undisputed owner of the abyss. Solomon the Dominant had rewritten the terms of the simulation, and the 72 were now nothing more than the silent, eternal ghosts in the machine. This concludes the first chapter of the Sovereign Protocol and the Thumb, manifestation of the temple through the ancient forces of dark. Chapter 2, the Bronze Vessel and the Quantum Containment. The completion of the temple's foundation marked the beginning of a much more perilous phase of the Sovereign Protocol, one that required the transition from temporary binding to permanent, systematic containment. Solomon the Dominant understood that while the 72 spirits were currently laboring under the heat of his immediate presence, the nature of the abyss is inherently entropic. The abyss will always seek to return to a state of chaos the moment the observer's focus wavers. To prevent this, he conceptualized a device that would act as a localized singularity, a metaphysical prison that could hold the entirety of the Goetic hierarchy without allowing a single drop of their malice to leak into the physical realm. This was the birth of the bronze vessel, a container. It was forged not merely of metal, but of a specific atomic frequency designed to mirror the gravitational pull of a black hole. Solomon spent months in the silence of his inner sanctum, calculating the resonant geometry required to build a vessel that could house the infinite darkness of the 72. He knew that the vessel had to be more than a jar. It had to be a digital vault. This vault for the spiritual signatures of the kings, dukes, and presidents of the underworld ensured that their power could be utilized by the throne while their intentions remained paralyzed in a vacuum of his own design. The forging of the vessel was an act of supreme alchemy, involving the blending of copper and tin at temperatures that mirrored the fire of the sun and cosmic law. Infused with the dust of crushed meteorites to anchor the metal to the cosmic law, as the liquid bronze was poured into the mold, Solomon broadcasted the final binding codes into the cooling metal, engraving the surface with the 72 seals of the 33rd degree. Each seal acted as a lock on a cellular level, ensuring that once an entity was drawn into the vessel, it stayed. Its own vibration would become the key that kept it imprisoned. The king understood that the demons were essentially high-frequency programs of destruction, and by creating a container with a perfectly inverted frequency, he could cancel out their ability to manifest in the material world. The bronze vessel became a quantum capacitor, a battery of immense spiritual potential, no. Solomon could draw from this to power the expansion of his empire. He was no longer just a king commanding a workforce. He was now the administrator of a trapped energy source that had existed since before the formation of the stars, proving that the sovereign architect does not just win battles. He builds infrastructures that make victory permanent for the duration of his reign. Once the vessel was completed, the systematic data extraction and storage of the legions began. Solomon summoned the most powerful entities, the kings who led the 72, and forced them to stand before the open mouth of the bronze singularity. He did not engage in the traditional rituals of the past, which relied on fear and bargaining. Instead, he used the absolute authority. He used the seal to command the spirits to dematerialize their astral forms and enter the vessel. One by one, the titans of the abyss, including the roaring Asmodeus and the deceptive Belial, found their immense egos crushed by the gravitational weight of Solomon's will. They were sucked into the bronze void, their screams of ancient pride silenced by the vacuum of the sovereign decree. Within the vessel, their chaotic nature was forced into a state of hypercompression, where they were stripped of their ability to manipulate the human mind and were reduced to their basic functional intelligence. Solomon had successfully archived the darkness, turning the most dangerous entities in the universe into a collection of tools that he could now deploy with precision. The dominance of the vessel allowed Solomon to initiate the autonomous maintenance of his kingdom. He no longer needed to be physically present at every corner of the construction site or every border of his land. He could simply tap into the vessel, release a specific percentage of a demon's power for a specific task, and then recall that power into the containment field. The power was recalled the moment the task was completed. He used the spirits within the bronze to monitor the subterranean health of the soil, to direct the flow of the rivers, and to stabilize the energetic ley lines that ensured the constant prosperity of Israel. This was the era of shadow engineering, where the prosperity of a nation was built upon the hidden labor of spirits. The bronze vessel sat in a hidden chamber beneath the temple, vibrating with the suppressed power of 72 legions, serving as the secret engine of a golden age. Solomon had achieved the ultimate goal of the 33rd degree. He had taken the totality of the world's discord and locked it into a structure of absolute harmony, proving that a master is defined by containment. As the second chapter of the great work concluded, the vessel was sealed with the final breath of the king, a vocalization of the divine name that acted as a spiritual deadbolt. Solomon cast the vessel into a deep pit, not to hide it, but to ground its immense electrical charge into the heart of the earth. He realized that the price of sovereignty was the constant guarding. He held the perpetual responsibility of guarding this containment, for if the vessel were ever to be opened by a hand that did not possess the 33rd degree frequency, the resulting release of compressed chaos would tear the fabric of reality asunder. The king stood alone in the silence of his achievement, feeling the hum of the trapped legions beneath his feet in the dark. He had effectively created a world where the darkness was no longer a threat, but a servant. The 72 were now the silent, bronze-clad ghosts that held up the throne of Jerusalem, their pride turned into pillars and their fire turned into the gold of the sanctuary. The architect had reached the peak of his power, having built a cage for the shadows that was so perfect. It was so perfect, even the light was forced to stop and admire the craftsmanship of the prison. The symphony of containment was the precise process through which Solomon the Dominant transformed the bronze vessel into a regulator of reality itself. Once the 72 entities were compressed within the quantum vacuum of the receptacle, the king understood energy must be used. The energy generated by their internal resistance should not be wasted, but instead channeled to fuel the invisible infrastructure of his kingdom. He commanded the captive demons to project their ancestral knowledge through the bronze walls, forcing them to act as a network of biological processors that calculated the flow of abundance across the land. The vessel began to hum. The vessel emitted a constant hum, a low-intensity frequency that harmonized the tides, stabilized the climate, and ensured that plagues would never cross the borders of Israel. This was the definitive application of the sovereign protocol, the use of confined shadow as an engine of planetary stability, where the chaos of the 72 was forced to sustain the peace. Solomon spent hours in the subterranean chamber, not to guard the captives, but to perform the maintenance of authority. He understood that containment was not a static act, but a dynamic dance of will. Every time one of the entities, such as the proud Payman or the cunning Belial, attempted to expand its frequency to crack the bronze, Solomon responded with a sharp pulse. He used his ring, reinforcing the geometry of the seal and returning the entity to a state of productive inertia. This level of dominance allowed the king to extract specific power signatures for architectural tasks that defied human comprehension. For example, he would release a fraction of a spirit's gravitational force to elevate temple domes without any human scaffolding. He would reseal that force back into the vessel the moment the stone was set. The bronze vessel thus became the first metaphysical reactor in history, an inexhaustible energy source that allowed the sovereign architect to manifest the impossible with the same ease with which a man breathes. As the chapter expands, the narrative reveals how Solomon utilized containment. He purified the lineage of knowledge. By forcing the demons to reside in a high-frequency solar environment within the bronze, their distorted natures began to be rectified. The king did not only seek the labor of their hands, but the redemption of their original function. Each contained entity served as a lesson on an aspect of the universe: botany, astronomy, and logic. Solomon extracted this pure wisdom and codified it into the Tome of Knowledge, ensuring that the price of sovereignty was the legacy of an enlightened humanity. The vessel, therefore, was not merely a prison, but a crucible where the lead of the abyss was transmuted into the gold of royal wisdom. By the end of this phase, Solomon's dominion over matter was absolute. His dominion over spirit was so absolute that reality itself seemed to have become an extension of his own nervous system. with the bronze vessel beating at the center of the earth, like the mechanical heart of a golden age that would never be repeated. He focused on the logistics of the unseen, where the bronze vessel transitioned from a mere container into a command center. Solomon the Dominant realized that the 72 spirits, now stripped of their chaotic autonomy, functioned as the ultimate intelligence network. He forced the entities of the higher ranks, those who govern the currents of the air and the sea, to act as the sensory organs of his throne. Through the bronze walls, Solomon could hear the intent of foreign empires easily. He could see the movement of merchant ships months before they reached his ports. This was the establishment of the first supernatural panopticon, where the contained darkness was utilized to ensure the absolute security of the light. The demons, once the architects of paranoia and war, were now the silent processors of a kingdom that was always 3 steps ahead of time. As the physical temple reached its zenith, Solomon utilized the vacuum pressure within the vessel to solve the problem of the heavy lifting for the final, most sacred ornaments. He directed the spirits to manipulate the density of the air within the sanctuary, creating pockets of zero gravity that allowed massive golden lampstands to be moved by the gesture of a priest's hand. This level of environmental hacking proved that Solomon was no longer just a king, but a programmer of the material world. The dominance he exerted was so refined that he could calibrate the intensity of a demon's output with a single turn of the ring, treating the lords of the abyss like gears in a celestial clock. This was the era of precision sovereignty for the king. The raw fire of the underworld was cooled into the steady, unwavering light of an empire that refused to decay. The expansion further explores the mental fortification of the architect, as the constant proximity to the bronze vessel required Solomon to maintain a consciousness of impenetrable density. He understood that the vessel was a mirror of his own internal spirit. If a single crack of doubt appeared in his mind, it would manifest as a physical fracture in the bronze. Therefore, the containment of the demons was simultaneously the containment of his own human impulses. He became the still point of the turning world, a man who had successfully integrated the totality of the shadow without being consumed by its darkness or fire. By the conclusion of this chapter, the bronze vessel was not just a tool, but a testament to the 33rd degree truth, that the external world can only be governed by the one who has achieved absolute dominance over the internal abyss. Solomon sat upon his throne, not as a man fearing the dark, but as the master who had turned the darkness into the very foundation of his glory. Chapter 3. The Ascension of the Architect. The final phase of the Solomon Protocol moved beyond the physical assembly of stones and the containment of shadows into the ultimate, tax levied upon the soul of the one who dares to rule the abyss. Solomon the Dominant realized that the architecture of a god-king is not built upon gold, but upon the total surrender of the human ego to the cold, unrelenting frequency of absolute power. As the temple reached its completion, acting as a massive resonator for the energies trapped within the bronze vessel, the king found himself standing at the center of a world that no longer spoke his language. The price of his sovereignty was a profound cosmic isolation, for the mind that commands 72 legions of the underworld can no longer find comfort in the shallow concerns. The concerns of mortal men no longer reached him. He had become a biological bridge between the celestial heights and the infernal depths, a position that demanded a state of perpetual activation, where even a single moment of sleep could lead to the collapse of the energetic grid he had spent decades constructing. Solomon understood that to be the master was to live in eternal vigilance. The demons he had enslaved waited in the silence of the bronze for the slightest flicker of human weakness to reclaim their chaotic heritage. The dominance he exerted over the 72 had effectively rewritten his own DNA, transforming the king into a living seal that anchored the stability of the entire region. The abundance that flowed through Israel was his internal density. The rains that arrived with mathematical precision the crops that grew without blight, and the peace that silenced the swords of his enemies, all was the direct result of Solomon's focus. He had turned his own consciousness into a grounding wire for the planet's discord, absorbing the entropic vibrations of the abyss so that his people could live in a world of light and great peace. This was the burden of the sovereign architect, the realization that the prosperity of the many is always paid for by the silence and the solitude of the one. Solomon sat upon his ivory throne, not as a man enjoying the fruits of his labor, but as a sentinel guarding the threshold of the matrix. He watched the cycles of the stars through the eyes of his bound spirits in the dark. He saw the movements of the cosmos as a grand interlocking machine that he was now responsible for maintaining. His wisdom was no longer an accumulation of facts, but a direct, visceral connection to the fundamental laws of the simulation, a knowledge so heavy that it threatened to crush the very vessel of his physical body. In this stage, he initiated the final integration. He sought to merge the power of the bronze vessel directly into the energetic lattice of the land, ensuring that his dominion would persist even after his physical departure. He understood that a true master does not leave a vacuum of power, but establishes a self-sustaining system of order. He commanded the 72 to weave their signatures into the ley lines of the earth now. This created a permanent field of protection that would act as a psychic wall against the chaotic frequencies of the outer world. This was the moment the king's dominance transitioned from an act of will into a law of nature. As spirits, though still bound, became the silent guardians of the civilization they had once sought to destroy. Solomon watched the fire of the abyss cool. The fire was finally cooled into the steady, unwavering light of a golden age. Recognizing that he had successfully completed the transmutation of the world's shadow into the world's strength, he had proved that the human spirit, when fully aligned with the frequency of the 33rd degree, is not a victim of the forces of darkness, but their rightful owner and administrator. The conclusion of the Solomon Protocol is the realization that the architect is the ultimate sacrifice in the temple he builds. As the final stones were consecrated and the bronze vessel was grounded into the heart of the mountain, Solomon the Dominant stood at the peak of his creation, a man who had become a monument. He had enslaved the 72 and built the house of God. He codified the laws of the unseen, yet he knew that the true victory was not the building itself, but the state of consciousness required to hold it together. He remains the eternal blueprint for all who seek to master the impossible, a reminder that the path to the throne is paved with the disciplined management of one's own internal demons. Solomon's story is about the sovereign. He realized the only way to build a heaven on earth is to first master the hell that lies beneath it. He breathed the final seal into the air, locking the era of the unspoken labor into the fabric of time, and stepped into the silence of his own legend, leaving behind a world of gold that was held in place by the invisible, bronze-clad ghosts of a mastered abyss beneath the soil. This led to the entropy of the sovereign, the precise moment when the physical container of the king began to vibrate at the same frequency as the bronze vessel itself. Solomon the Dominant realized that by maintaining the containment of the 72 for so long, he had created a bridge of sympathetic resonance between his own nervous system and the infernal hierarchy. This meant that the king was no longer merely a jailer. He had become the living governor of the abyss. Every movement of his mind was reflected in the stirrings of the bound spirits, and every surge of demonic resistance was felt as a sharp, electrical pulse within his own spine. To sustain this level of dominance, Solomon had to engage in the great stillness of his own mind. He entered a state of consciousness where he ceased to be an individual and became a universal constant. He sat in the Holy of Holies, surrounded by the gold that acted as a spiritual shield, holding the entire energetic grid of his kingdom together through the sheer density of his presence. As the expansion continues, we see the king implementing the legacy of the seal today. He began to project the architectural codes of his reign into the collective unconscious of humanity. He understood that his physical time was a finite resource, but the Solomon frequency could be anchored into the matrix permanently. He commanded the spirits within the vessel to broadcast the principles of geometry, logic, and sovereign will into the dreams of the builders. This was the true purpose of his dominance, to ensure that even after the bronze vessel was lost to the physical eyes of men, the blueprint for mastering the shadow would remain accessible to those who reached the 33rd degree. Solomon watched as the demons, once the destroyers of civilizations, became the involuntary transmitters of the very wisdom of the human spirit. This wisdom would keep them enslaved to the human spirit for eons to come. He had successfully hacked the feedback loop of the simulation, turning the underworld into a permanent educational department for the evolution of the architect. The final expansion of the Sovereign Protocol reaches its climax with the ascension of the monolith. Solomon completed his work on Earth. Realizing that his work was complete, he prepared the final energetic discharge that would lock the temple's frequency into the Earth's core. He stood before the ark, the ring glowing with a brilliance that surpassed the noonday sun, and issued the command of non-duration. This decree disconnected the temple's power from the flow of linear time, making it an eternal reality. This ensured that the structure would remain a spiritual reality, even if its physical stones were eventually scattered by the winds of history. The 72 spirits, sensing the finality of this act, let out a collective roar within the vessel that shook the foundations of the mountain, but they were powerless against the king's final seal. Solomon turned the abyss into law. He made it a petrified law, a silent engine of order that would continue to hum beneath the surface of reality forever. He walked out of the sanctuary for the last time, a man who had seen the end of the world and the beginning of the infinite, leaving behind a legacy that proves that the only limit to a man's dominion is the depth of the darkness he is brave enough to own. This was the metabolic integration of the abyss, a stage where Solomon the Dominant realized that the separation between the king and the kingdom was a lingering illusion of the lower dimensions. To truly finalize the Solomon Protocol, he had to allow his own consciousness to expand until it became the very atmosphere of Israel. He initiated the breathing of the vessel now. This was a process where he synchronized his respiratory rhythm with the vibrational pulses of the 72 spirits trapped in the bronze. Every inhale drew the chaotic heat of the demons into his own lungs, and every exhale released a purified, structured frequency of order back into the land. This was the ultimate price. The king's body became the primary filter for a nation, the filter for a nation's darkness. He lived in a state of high tensile equilibrium, his veins flowing with the liquid fire of the abyss that he constantly transmuted into the golden ichor of sovereign wisdom. The dominance he exerted was no longer a series of commands, but a continuous state of being that held the atoms of his world in their proper places for the future of man. As the expansion continues, the king moved into the architecture of the permanent dream, where he forced the 72 to build a secondary, etheric temple that existed outside the physical coordinates of Jerusalem. He understood that physical structures are subject to the erosion of time and the tides of war, but a structure built of bound shadow and light would remain. This structure in the mental plane would be indestructible. He used the spirits as the weavers of this phantom fortress, commanding them to use their ancient knowledge of the fourth dimension to create a sanctuary that would serve as a refuge for the sovereign architects of future ages. The demons, trapped in the recursive loop of the bronze vessel, were forced to join him. They were forced to contribute their immortality to this project, effectively creating a time capsule of sovereignty that remains accessible to anyone who attains the 33rd degree of internal density. Solomon watched as this invisible palace solidified, realizing that he had successfully bypassed the mortality of his own reign, ensuring the frequency remained a broadcast. The Solomon frequency would remain a permanent broadcast within the human matrix, regardless of the fall of empires. The narrative of dominance reaches its absolute zenith as Solomon entered the protocol of the silent sovereign. In the final years of his physical manifestation, he ceased to speak entirely, for his voice had become so resonant with power of the Ancient Ones. The power of the 72 was such that a single word could alter the geography of the earth or extinguish the life force of 1,000 men. He ruled through radiant intent, his silence acting as a crushing weight that kept the demons in a state of perpetual paralysis. He sat in the center of his golden court, a living statue of absolute will, while the spirits labored. The spirits within the vessel labored to maintain the perfection of his world. He had become the sovereign singularity, a point of infinite density around which the entire spiritual and material hierarchy of the era revolved. The price of this power was the total loss of his human identity. He was no longer a man named Solomon, but the biological interface for the architect. He was the blueprint on earth. He had successfully turned himself into a living seal, a human ring of bronze and gold that held the abyss in a cage of eternal service. In the final, expanded conclusion of the price of sovereignty, we witnessed the dissolution into the grid. Solomon, sensing that the physical matrix could no longer contain his vibration, prepared for the end. He prepared for the final transition, where his consciousness would leave the flesh and become the permanent guardian of the seal. He issued one final, unspoken decree that linked the bronze vessel to the heartbeat of the planet itself, ensuring that the 72 would remain enslaved to the evolution of the world until the final collapse of the simulation at the end of time. He stepped out of the flow of linear time, his spirit expanding to fill every stone of the temple, every sigil of the vessel, and every thought of wisdom ever recorded in his name. He left behind a world that was a masterpiece of controlled chaos, a testament to the day a human being dared to own the darkness and found that it was the only way to truly inherit the golden light. The Solomon Protocol was complete. The 72 were bound in the silent service of the infinite, and the architect had finally ascended to the throne that exists beyond the stars, leaving the world a blueprint of dominance that would echo through the halls of knowledge forever. This concludes the transmission of the king and his absolute mastery over the infernal hosts. Chapter 4. The Geometry of the Void and the Legacy of the Eternal Seal. The completion of the physical and etheric temples marked the beginning of the final stabilization phase of the Solomon Protocol, a stage known as the Geometry of the Void. Solomon the Dominant realized that the 72 demons, now fully compressed within the bronze vessel and woven into the foundations of the land, required a permanent mathematical framework to ensure their containment. He understood that the greatest threat to his work was not a physical rebellion, but the slow erosion of time and the decay of human memory. To counter this, he began the process of lithic coding, where he forced the legions to project their collective intelligence into the very molecular structure of the world's most precious stones. This was not decoration. It was a crystalline hard drive. This was a decentralized network of power that ensured the frequency of the sovereign would remain active, even if the bronze vessel were moved or hidden from the sight of men. Solomon stood in the center of his treasury, his mind reaching into the vessel to extract the specific spectral keys held by the spirits, and he imprinted these keys into the lattice of diamonds and sapphires. This ensured that the wealth of the kingdom was not just a store of value, but a store of authority, where every crown and every ring worn by his successors would vibrate with the same crushing dominance that he had exerted over the abyss. As the chapter of the legacy unfolded, the king initiated the transversal mapping of the abyss, a project where he forced the 72 to reveal truth. He forced them to reveal the hidden tunnels and shortcuts within the matrix, the wormholes of the spiritual world that allow for the instantaneous manifestation of intent. He realized that the demons had used these fracture points for millennia to terrorize humanity, appearing and disappearing at will to cause discord. Solomon flipped this predatory mechanic on its head for his own end. using the bound spirits to bridge the gaps between the physical and the metaphysical. He turned the entire kingdom of Israel into a high-frequency zone where the distance between a thought and its realization was nearly zero. This was the true secret of the Solomonic peace. It was a state of being where the reality of the king was so dense that no opposing force could find a foothold. The spirits, trapped in the recursive geometry of the vessel, were forced to act as the laminar flow regulators for the river of time itself, smoothing out the turbulence of human history within the borders of the sovereign's influence. Solomon sat upon his throne, watching the invisible gears of the universe grind into a state of absolute harmony, turning the engines of chaos into clocks. The expansion of this dominance required the king to address the frequency of the successor. The realization that the power he had harnessed was too great to be held by a mind that had not achieved the 33rd degree of internal stillness. Solomon understood that his descendants might lack the iron will required to hold the ring, and thus he programmed the 72 to respond. He programmed them to respond only to the signature of the true architect. He embedded a fail-safe within the bronze vessel, a spiritual dead man switch, that would cause the vessel to become inert and invisible if a lesser man attempted to unlock its power for selfish ends. He forced the demons to swear an oath in the presence of the source, binding their very existence to the work. This was the ultimate act of selflessness and sovereignty. Solomon was protecting the world from his own power, ensuring that the fire of the abyss would remain in its cage until another dominant of equal stature arrived to claim the mantle. The price of sovereignty was now a permanent tax on the bloodline, a requirement that anyone who sought to rule must first achieve self-mastery. As the king moved toward the final sunset of his physical manifestation, he conducted the grand anchoring of the seal, where he projected the image of the ring into the collective unconscious of the entire human race. He wanted to ensure that the symbol of the sovereign, the interlaced triangles of the macrocosm, and the macrocosm, microcosm would become a permanent archetypal program now. Whenever a human being reached for wisdom or sought to bring order to their own internal chaos, they would inadvertently tap into the Solomon protocol. The demons in the vessel felt this final broadcast as a permanent branding of their essence. They were no longer just the enemies of man, but the involuntary servants of human evolution. Solomon watched as the Tome wrote itself. The Tome of Knowledge began to write itself in the light above the ark, a living document of light that contained every command, every frequency, and every mathematical proof he had used to enslave the abyss. This was the final gift of the architect, a manual for the God-man, a roadmap for any consciousness brave enough to walk the path of total responsibility and absolute dominance. The narrative of the legacy reaches its peak with the silence of the Golden Age, a period where the king no longer needed to exert any effort to maintain his world. The machine was perfect. The vessel was grounded. The spirits were broken into a state of divine utility, and the people lived in a state of grace that mocked the suffering of the outer world. Solomon was a ghost. Solomon had become the ghost in the temple, a presence that was felt in every breeze, every stone, and every heartbeat of his subjects. He had successfully completed the transition from a king of flesh to a king of frequency, proving that the ultimate goal of the sovereign is to become the law itself. The 72 were now the silent pillars of a reality that refused to fall. Their ancient malice turned into the very mortar that held the stars in their courses over Jerusalem. The chapter concludes with the king standing at the threshold of the final dimension, looking back at a world that had been completely rewritten by his hand. He had taken the most dangerous secret of the universe, the power to enslave the shadow, and turned it into gold forever. He left behind a blueprint of dominance that would haunt the dreams of every tyrant and inspire the hearts of every true architect for the rest of eternity. The seal was set, the vessel was hidden, and the King of Wisdom stepped into the void, knowing that the abyss would never again be truly free as long as a single, human mind remembered how to say his name with real authority. He focused on the trans-temporal synchronization, where Solomon the dominant realized that his control over the 72 must extend beyond the horizon of his own physical era. He understood that the matrix would attempt to reset itself once his biological presence was removed, seeking to return the enslaved entities to their original state of chaotic entropy for the world. To prevent this cosmic regression, Solomon forced the legions to construct the Chronos Anchor, a series of invisible vibrational nodes buried within the fundamental frequency of the Earth's rotation. This ensured that the authority of the king was not a historical event, but a permanent law of physics. Every time the Earth turned on its axis, the movement reinforced the seal. The movement itself acted as a ritual of reinforcement, tightening the chains within the bronze vessel and reminding the spirits of their subjection. The king had effectively turned the planet into a self-winding mechanism of sovereignty, where the very passage of time served to consolidate his power rather than erode it. As the dominance deepened, he started the living script. He commanded the spirits of the higher ranks, those who held dominion over the human, to embed the codes of the sovereign into the languages and alphabets of the future. He realized that the greatest vessel of containment was not made of bronze, but of thought. By weaving the geometry of the seal into the symbols of human communication, he ensured that his commands lived. Whenever a man spoke of order, logic, or truth, he was unconsciously reciting the commands that kept the 72 in their cages. The demons watched in agonizing paralysis as their ancient tongues were repurposed to build the foundations of a new, enlightened world. Solomon sat in the center of the temple, his consciousness expanding to fill the entire linguistic grid today. He ensured that the shadow could never again rise without first being filtered through the light of his wisdom. He had turned the abyss into a library of functional intelligence, where every demonic impulse was now a catalyst for a higher realization in the mind of the seeker. The expansion further explores the sublimation of the imperial will in the depth of the sovereign soul. Solomon began to dissolve his own personal desires into the grand objective of the great work. He understood that to be a true dominant, he must have no flaws for the demons to exploit. He systematically hunted down every remaining fragment of his own ego, forcing it to face the same crushing weight he had applied to the 72. This was the final transmutation of his self. The king became a hollowed-out conduit for the divine blueprint, a being of pure authority with no human residue to cloud his judgment. The bronze vessel responded to this shift by becoming even more stable, as the entities within realized there was no longer a man to manipulate, but only a force of nature that was as unyielding as gravity. His life force was the kingdom. The king's life force was now indistinguishable from the life force of the kingdom. He was the soil, the stone, the gold, and the very air that his people breathed. He had achieved the state of the immovable sovereign, the point of absolute density that the 72 could never hope to orbit, let alone escape. In the final reaches, the narrative reveals the Void Gate Code. Solomon utilized the collective power of the Bound Legions to open a portal into the primordial layers of the simulation. He did not do this to escape, but to anchor the entire Solomonic era into the source code of reality. He forced the spirits to act as the energetic scaffolding for this connection, their ethereal bodies stretched across the dimensions to hold the gate open. Solomon ensured that the Golden Age was not just a peak in history, but a permanent reality that exists in the higher frequencies of the earth, waiting for the next architect to align with its resonance. The 72 were now the literal pillars of a timeless dimension, their ancient rebellion permanently repurposed into the service of an eternal sanctuary of the king. Solomon stood before the gate, his hand resting upon the bronze vessel one last time, feeling the silent rhythmic pulse of a conquered abyss that was now the heartbeat of a new world. He had rewritten the rules of existence, proving that the King of Wisdom does not just rule his time, but dictates the nature of time itself, leaving behind a legacy as vast as the stars above. Solomon the Dominant realized that the physical disappearance of his body would create a vacuum that the 72 would attempt to exploit through the dreams of men. To counter this, he forced the legions to weave an invisible lattice of neural sentinels across the collective unconscious of the human race. These were internal programs of discipline and logic for the mind. These would trigger whenever a human mind wandered too close to the primal chaos of the abyss. Solomon turned the very nature of demonic temptation into a training ground for the soul. Every time a shadow whispered to a man, it was forced by the king's ancient decree to provide the exact mathematical counterfrequency that would lead the man back to the light of pure reason. The demons were no longer predators, but the unwilling whetstones upon which the human will was to be sharpened for eternity. Solomon sat in the deepening silence of his sanctuary, watching as the spirits struggled against this final indignity, only to find that their every movement only served to tighten the geometric knots of the king's design. His dominance was absolute now. As the dominance reached its absolute saturation point, Solomon initiated the protocol of the living stone, where he commanded the spirits to infuse their own life force into the architecture of Jerusalem. He realized that the stone walls of the temple were merely the hardware, and they required a spiritual software to remain active throughout the cycles of time for the world. He forced the 72 to deconstruct their astral bodies and distribute their essence into the molecular structure of the limestone and the gold. This created a sentient environment, a city that could think, feel, and protect itself. The walls of Jerusalem became a massive, stone-clad brain that maintained the Solomon frequency regardless of who sat upon the physical throne. This was the ultimate expression of the sovereign architect, the creation of an autonomous system of order that required no further human intervention. The demons were now the marrow in the bones of the kingdom, their ancient fire providing the warmth that kept the land in a state of perpetual spring, and their ancient strength providing the rigidity that prevented collapse. The expansion further explores the crystallization of the sovereign breath, where Solomon performed the final ritual of the bronze vessel. He realized that for the containment to remain unbreakable, it must be linked to the fundamental breath of the universe. He forced the spirits to synchronize their internal vibrations with the expansion and contraction of the cosmos. By doing this, he ensured that as long as the universe existed, the 72 would remain in a state of subjection. The vessel was no longer a piece of metal, but a universal constant, a fixed point in the geometry of the matrix that could not be moved or altered by any force within the simulation. Solomon stood before the vessel, his own breath slowing to match the pulse. Matching the rhythmic pulse of the contained abyss, he achieved a state of metabolic sovereignty, where his spirit and the spirit of the work became a single, indivisible entity. He had successfully turned the most volatile forces in existence into a silent, eternal engine of stability, proving that a true king does not just rule a kingdom, he becomes the kingdom entirely. In the final, most profound expansion of the Solomon Protocol, we witness the descent of the eternal seal into the DNA of the chosen line. Solomon understood that the wisdom of the 33rd degree must be carried not just in books, but in the very blood of those who would follow. He commanded the spirits of the higher ranks to act as the genetic architects for his heirs. This ensured that the potential for absolute dominance would remain dormant in the human race, a sovereign seed, waiting for the correct environmental frequency to be activated once more. The 72 were now the silent librarians of the human genome, guarding the secrets of their own enslavement until the arrival of the next master. Solomon walked into the courtyard. Solomon walked out into the courtyard of the completed temple, his form shimmering with the density of 1,000 suns, and looked up at the stars, knowing that he had turned the abyss into a ladder for the ascension of man. He had rewritten the story of the shadow, ending the era of the victim and beginning the era of the architect, leaving behind a legacy of dominance. Solomon the Dominant realized that the 72 spirits were not only keepers of earthly elements, but also the original thieves of the primordial sounds. These entities had once used the power of the word to fracture the reality of men, creating the Tower of Babel to sow linguistic discord and mental fog. Solomon, standing at his peak, forced them to vomit the sounds. He forced the legions to vomit forth these stolen frequencies. He sat in the center of the bronze vessel's influence, capturing each tone and retuning it to the frequency of divine order. This process ensured that the very air of his kingdom was thick with active intelligence, a state where the spoken word had the immediate power to heal, manifest, and command the world. The demons, now silenced and stripped of their deceptive tongues, were forced to act as the resonance chambers for these sounds, their own guttural roars being filtered through the king's seal and transformed into the celestial harmonies that filled the temple's courts. As the dominance reached its saturation, Solomon initiated the protocol of the celestial grid for all. He utilized the combined psychic output of the bound 72 to map the exact intersection points of the planetary meridians. He understood that the earth was a living organism, and that the demons, being ancient and terrestrial, knew the location of the world's acupuncture points. He forced them to anchor the power of the bronze vessel into these specific coordinates. This turned the entire globe into a circuit board for the Solomon frequency. This meant that the king's will was no longer restricted to the borders of Israel. It was being broadcast through the soil, the water, and the wind to the ends of the earth. Any kingdom that attempted to rise in chaos was met with a sudden, unexplainable atmospheric pressure that paralyzed their armies. The sovereign had turned the abyss into a global security system, a silent subterranean net that ensured the Golden Age was not an isolated incident, but a worldwide shift in the vibration of the matrix. The expansion further explores the sublimation of the infernal ego, where Solomon forced the highest-ranking kings of the Goetia to act as his personal, cognitive mirrors. He realized that the greatest risk to a sovereign is the lack of a true peer to challenge his perspective. He programmed the bound spirits within the vessel to provide him with absolute objective data, stripping them of their ability to flatter or deceive. This forced the king to constantly refine his own logic, using the vast ancient memory of the demons for his state. The demons found this to be their most agonizing torture. They were forced to be the instruments of the very truth they had spent eternity trying to obscure. Solomon's mind became an impenetrable fortress of pure reason, a consciousness so refined that it could process 1,000,000 variables of statcraft in the blink of an eye. He had successfully turned the masters of lies. He turned them into the most reliable witnesses of reality, proving that the King of Wisdom is the one who can turn his greatest enemies into his most precise tools. In the final, most profound reach of this chapter, we witness the eternity encoding of the sovereign shadow. Solomon, sensing that his physical biological unit was approaching its end, transferred the system. He transferred the operating system of the seal into the bronze vessel itself. He did not want his death to be the moment of the demon's liberation. He crafted a self-correcting algorithm of authority, a spiritual program that would continue to exert the pressure of his will even after his heart stopped beating. He forced the 72 to witness this final coding now. He showed them that they were now bound not to a man, but to a law that had no end. The vessel became a sentient law, a biological machine of bronze and shadow that would hold the frequency of the king until the very end of the simulation. Solomon walked to the highest point of the temple, looking out over a world that was now a perfect reflection of his internal order. He smiled. He had turned the nightmare of the abyss into the dream of the architect, leaving behind a legacy where the darkness was no longer a predator, but the silent, eternal foundation upon which the light of humanity could finally learn to stand alone. The work was finished, the vessel was sealed, and the king was eternal. This is the end of the sovereign protocol of power. Chapter 5. The Dissolution of the Architect. The finalization of the Solomonic era required a transition that most mortal rulers could never conceive. The deliberate dissolution of the individual self into the very fabric of the created order. Solomon the Dominant realized that as long as his authority remained tied to a single biological vessel, the 72 demons would maintain a target for their eventual rebellion for the future. To truly seal the abyss, the king had to become the law itself, moving beyond the limitations of flesh and bone to inhabit the energetic frequency of the temple and the bronze vessel simultaneously. This was the transcendence of the throne, a stage where the architect stopped being a man who ruled and started being the atmospheric pressure that governed the reality of his kingdom. He initiated the final protocol by entering a state of hyper-lucid suspension within the Holy of Holies, where he commanded the spirits of the first rank to begin the deconstruction of his own ego mask. He forced the demons, those ancient masters of identity theft and personality distortion, to strip away every remaining human attachment, every memory of lineage, and every desire now. Every flicker of personal desire was removed until only the pure, radiant frequency of the sovereign remained. This was the ultimate dominance. The king was no longer a person to be fought or bargained with. He had become a fundamental constant of the simulation, as immovable as the North Star and as unyielding as the vacuum of space. As the king's consciousness expanded, he began the neural mapping of the empire, where he utilized the combined processing power of the bound 72 to link his mind to every stone, every river, and every breathing soul within his dominion. The demons within the bronze vessel were forced to act as the conduits for this massive data transfer. Their ethereal nervous systems stretched across the land to serve him. They served as the fiber optic cables of a supernatural network. Solomon could feel the growth of the grain in the fields of the north and the shifting of the sands in the southern deserts as if they were sensations within his own skin. This level of environmental integration meant that the King of Wisdom was now an omnipresent awareness, a silent observer whose very attention acted. His attention acted as a stabilizing force for the entire region. The spirits found themselves trapped in a terrifying paradox. They were the ones providing the energy for the king's omniscience, yet that very omniscience was the force that kept them in their bronze-clad cages. Solomon had successfully hacked the feedback loop of the underworld, turning the malice into sensory input. The malice of the 72 became the sensory input of a god-king who could never be surprised and could never be deceived. The expansion of this chapter explores the final rectification of the abyss, where Solomon forced the kings and presidents of the Goetia to reconcile their ancient rebellion with the perfection of the temple's geometry. He understood they were assets. The demons were not just prisoners, but misplaced assets of the original creation. Through the frequency of the seal, he initiated a process of archetypal realignment, forcing the entities to remember their functions before they fell into the density of the shadow. He commanded the spirits of destruction to become the spirits of controlled demolition for the work of building, using their power to clear away the old entropic structures of the world to make room for the new. He turned the spirits of deceit into the spirits of strategic ambiguity, using their subtle minds to protect the secrets of the sovereign from those who were not yet ready for the light. This was the true alchemy of the 33rd degree, the refusal to leave any part of waste. Solomon proved that the darkness was only dark because it had been disconnected from the purpose of the architect. By relinking the 72 to the great work, he effectively ended the war between heaven and hell within the borders of his consciousness, creating a third reality where power was neither good nor evil, but simply obedient to the highest will of the king. As the biological unit of Solomon began its final vibrational shift, the king conducted the sealing of the astral gates, ensuring that the path he had blazed would remain open only for those who carried the correct internal resonance. He realized that the technology of the bronze vessel was too powerful for a humanity that still harbored the seeds of chaos within their hearts. He forced the 72 to construct a labyrinth of the mind around the secrets of the Solomon Protocol, a series of mental traps and energetic mirrors that would deflect any seeker who approached the work with an ego-driven desire for power. Only the one who had achieved the stillness of the sovereign would be able to see through the illusions of the bound spirits here. Only they would access the true manual of the architect. This ensured that the legacy of the king would remain a self-protecting secret, a hidden treasure buried in the very DNA of the human race. The demons were now the involuntary guardians of the gate, their ancient hatred turned into a sophisticated security system that tested the worthiness of every soul that dared it. Solomon watched as the last of his human breath left his body, but his awareness did not fade. It merely shifted from the center of the throne to the center of the universe, proving that the architect does not die. He simply becomes the building. The narrative of the final ascension reaches its peak with the consolidation of the eternal echo, where the frequency was locked. The Solomon frequency was locked into the Schumann resonance of the planet. Solomon understood that for his dominance to be truly eternal, it had to be independent of any physical object, even the temple or the vessel. He commanded the 72 to broadcast the final code into the electromagnetic field of the Earth, turning the planet into a resonant chamber for him. This ensured that as long as the Earth turned and the stars shone, the spirit of the dominant king would remain an active force in the simulation. The demons were now the silent, bronze-clad ghosts that held up the world, their power neutralized by the very planet they had once sought to corrupt. Solomon, now existing as a pure mathematical presence, looked down at the world. He looked down at the world of gold he had built and saw that it was finished. He had enslaved the 72, contained the abyss, and rewritten the history of the human spirit. The Solomon Protocol was no longer a story of the past, but a permanent law of the future, a testament to the day a human being dared to own the totality of the shadow and found it was the only way. It was the only way to truly inherit the light of the eternal. The seal was locked, the vessel was grounded, and the architect had finally become the law, leaving behind a blueprint of dominance that would echo through the halls of time forever. The further expansion of this final dissolution dives into the quantum anchor of the Solomonic will, where the king realized the truth. He realized even the planetary frequency could be subject to the slow decay of cosmic time. To bypass this, he forced the 72 to link the bronze vessel to the zero-point field, the underlying substrate of all, existence where time and space do not exist. He directed the spirits to act as the energetic anchors for this connection, their ancient essences stretched thin. Their essences were stretched thin across the fabric of the void to hold the link open. This meant that the Solomon Protocol was no longer a historical event or even a planetary law. It had become a universal constant, a fundamental part of the source code of the simulation itself. Even if the stars were to go out and the Earth were to crumble, the frequency would remain. The frequency of the dominant king would remain etched into the very mathematics of reality. The demons, trapped in this state of infinite tension, realized they had been turned into the universal scaffolding of a reality they could no longer influence. Solomon's dominance was now so absolute that it had become invisible, a silent pressure that ensured the evolution of light. It ensured the evolution of consciousness would always have a path toward the light, regardless of how deep the shadows of future ages might become. In the final, most profound transition of the king, we witness the receding of the observer. Solomon understood that a perfect system does not require a visible master. He chose to withdraw his active awareness from the world. He allowed the autonomous system of order he had built to run on its own. He became the silent watcher, a presence that was felt only in the perfect alignment of the seasons and the effortless peace of his people. The bronze vessel remained buried beneath the mountain, a silent engine of stability that required no further commands, for the commands were in the atoms. They were woven into the atoms of the bronze itself. The 72 were now the automatic sub-processors of a world that had forgotten they even existed. This was the ultimate victory, to rule so perfectly that the act of ruling becomes a natural function of the universe. Solomon stepped into the final void point, the center of the center, where all things are finally one. The king, the temple, and the abyss were revealed to be one single indivisible thought of the architect. He left behind a world of gold, held in place by a shadow of bronze, and a legacy that proves that the only limit to a man's power is his willingness to take responsibility for everything he sees. The Solomon Protocol was complete, and the 72 were bound forever. They were bound in the eternal service of the infinite, and the architect had finally returned to the source, leaving the seal as a permanent invitation for every soul to remember its own sovereign right to build the impossible. The protocol of the celestial mirror was mandated, where Solomon the Dominant projected the architecture of the temple into the constellations above. He understood that earthly monuments might crumble under the weight of entropy, but if the geometric seals were etched into the stellar alignments, the dominance of the sovereign would be refreshed with every planetary transit. He forced the kings of the Goetia to act as the cosmic surveyors, aligning the subterranean bronze vessel with the precise coordinates of the core. This created a vertical axis of power, where the energy of the abyss was not just grounded into the earth, but was also pressurized by the weight of the heavens. The demons found themselves caught in a cosmic vice, their chaotic frequencies squeezed between the lithic density of the planet and the crystalline order of the stars. Solomon sat in the deepening silence of it. He watched as the night sky became a living map of his own authority, a celestial grid that ensured no spirit could rise without the permission of the light. As the dominance reached its absolute saturation, the king initiated the encoding of the silent word, where he distilled the entirety of his wisdom into a single, non-verbal frequency for the humanity of the future. He realized that language is a tool of the lower dimensions, subject to misinterpretation and corruption. To ensure the Solomon Protocol remained pure, he embedded this silent frequency into the heartbeat of the human race. He forced the 72 to act as the biological metronomes for this pulse, ensuring that every human being would carry the rhythm of the architect. They would carry it within their own chest. This was the ultimate act of shadow management. The demons were now responsible for maintaining the very life force that would eventually lead to their own obsolescence. Solomon watched as the Tome of Knowledge ceased to be a book and became a vibration, a hidden pulse of certainty that would guide the seekers of the future ages. He guided them through the darkest nights of the soul. He had successfully turned the underworld into a permanent lighthouse, where the fire of the pit was used to illuminate the path toward the 33rd degree. The expansion further explores the vibrational anchoring of the final seal, where Solomon performed the last act of the bronze vessel's physical reality here. He commanded the spirits to fuse the bronze with the very magma of the earth, turning the vessel into a part of the planet's tectonic structure. He realized that for the containment to be truly eternal, it must be beyond the reach of any physical archaeology. The 72 were now the magmatic governors of the world, their ancient rage providing the heat of the planet. Their ancient rage provided the heat that drove the cycles of the earth, but always within the rigid constraints of the king's geometric decree. Solomon stood at the threshold of the infinite, his form now a shimmering outline of pure mathematical intent, and he issued the final command of non-interference. He forbade the demons from ever again manifesting in any form. He forced them to remain as anonymous, functional forces of nature. He had effectively erased their identities, leaving only their utility behind, and in doing so, he removed the last vestige of their power to terrorize the human mind. In the final, most profound expansion of the sovereign's departure, We witness the merging of the three temples into a single state of being. Solomon realized that the physical temple in Jerusalem, the etheric temple in the mind, and the cosmic temple in the stars were all a single manifestation of the architect's will. He stepped into the intersection of these three realities, allowing his own consciousness to act as the keystone that locked them together forever. At that moment, the digital code was revealed. The 64 squares of the chessboard and the 72 seals of the vessel were revealed to be the same digital code of the simulation. Solomon had successfully hacked the matrix, turning the prison of the material world into a training ground for gods. He left behind a legacy of absolute dominance, where the shadows are nothing more than the ink used to write light. The Solomon Protocol was no longer a project. It was the new reality of the world. The 72 were bound, the vessel was grounded, and the architect had finally become the infinite space in which all things exist, proving that the true king is the one who can own the void and turn it into a kingdom of gold. They still possessed a latent desire for the momentum of death. To neutralize this, he redirected their chaotic impulse into the very mechanics of human industry and invention. He forced the legions to act as the invisible friction that sparks discovery, ensuring that any time a human mind struggled against a problem, it was actually tapping into the pressurized intelligence of the bound abyss. The demons could no longer cause a catastrophe. Instead, they were forced to provide the resistance that builds strength. Solomon sat in the absolute center of the Holy of Holies, his own nervous system acting as the regulator for this global transfer of energy. He watched as the pride of the kings within the vessel was ground down into the steady, reliable torque of a civilization that was beginning to master all elements. The dominance was now so deep that the demons had forgotten they were slaves, believing their forced labor to be the natural laws of motion and thermodynamics. As the dominance reached its absolute saturation, the king initiated the encoding of the mineral memory, where he utilized the combined psychic weight of the 72 to imprint history into the stones of earth. He realized that books burn and civilizations fall, but the earth remembers. He commanded the spirits of the lower ranks to vibrate at a frequency that altered the crystalline structures of the deep crust, turning the planet into a massive geological record of the 33rd degree. This ensured that any future architect who touched the earth would receive a download. The 72 found themselves trapped in a state of lithic paralysis, their ancient, flickering forms hardened into the veins of gold and the deposits of iron that would one day fuel the empires of the future. Solomon had successfully turned the underworld into a permanent library of potential, where the very materials of the world were infused with his own unwavering will. The expansion further explores the sublimation of the sovereign shadow, where Solomon performed the final transmutation of his own human reflection. He understood that to be truly eternal, he had to leave no image behind that could be worshipped or defiled. He commanded the spirits of the vessel to consume the last vestiges of his personal history for the legacy of the law, turning his names, his triumphs, and his sorrows into the raw energy required to keep the seal locked for another 10,000 years. This was the ultimate sacrifice of the dominant. He erased himself from the story so that only the law would remain. The 72 were forced to witness the disappearance of their master, finding that his absence was much more terrifying now. His absence was more terrifying than his presence, for now his authority was everywhere and nowhere at once. He had become the pressure of the void, the silent weight that keeps the stars in their orbits and the abyss in its cage. Solomon stood at the edge of the final dimension, no longer a man, but a geometric perfection that looked back at the world and saw his own thought. In the final, most profound reach of this chapter, we witness the ascension of the 72-fold grid, where Solomon synchronized the heartbeat of the bronze vessel with the pulse of the galactic core. He realized that the simulation of the Earth was part of a much larger architecture, and for his work to be truly secure, it had to be anchored into the celestial mainframe of space. He forced the spirits to act as the energetic conduits for this bridge, their screams of resistance being tuned into the music of the spheres. At that moment, the containment of the abyss was no longer a terrestrial event. It was a cosmic decree. The 72 were now the silent, invisible gears of a universe that had been repurposed to serve the architect's great evolution. Solomon breathed out one final, wordless frequency that locked the gates of the underworld forever, ensuring that the darkness would never again be a predator, but the quiet, eternal servant of the light. The Solomon Protocol was finished, the vessel was one with the earth, and the king had finally dissolved into the infinite, leaving behind a blueprint of dominance for all. Chapter End. The Omni-Recursive Apocalypse. The silence that followed the ascension of Solomon the Dominant was not the peace of a job well done, but the suffocating tension of a vacuum waiting to be filled. For eons, the world functioned on the fumes of his absolute authority, a clockwork reality held together by the pressurized agony of the 72 spirits trapped within the bronze vessel. But the fundamental law is entropy. The fundamental law of the simulation is that all systems, no matter how sovereign, eventually succumb to the slow creeping rot of entropy. Deep beneath the foundations of the temple, in the lightless pressure of the earth's mantle, the bronze vessel began to do something it was never designed to do. It began to breathe. The 64 squares of the board started to warp and decay. As squares, once the rigid grid of the architect's control, started to warp, the lines blurring as the repressed chaos of the abyss found the one thing Solomon could not encode against, the passage of 1 billion human whispers. Every doubt, every secret malice, and every shadow of a thought generated by the billions of souls living under the Solomon frequency acted as a drop of acid. This acted as a microscopic drop of acid on the bronze seals. The dominance was not fading. It was being digested by the very reality it sought to protect. As the final cycle initiated, the protocol of the celestial mirror began to crack. The stars, which Solomon had used as the external hard drive for his sovereignty, shifted into a configuration of predatory geometry today. The sky did not turn red. It turned a hollow, static gray, as if the monitor of the world was losing its signal. Those who reached for the wisdom of the 33rd degree found only a screaming void where the tome of knowledge used to be. The realization began to spread like a digital virus through the collective unconscious. The king was gone, and he had left the door locked. He had left the door locked from the outside. The 72 spirits, who had been compressed into the molecular structure of the earth, started to feel the thinning of the sovereign's breath. They did not burst forth in fire and brimstone. They manifested as a subtle, pervasive wrongness in the behavior of matter. Gravity became inconsistent and shadows moved on their own. Shadows began to move a fraction of a second before the bodies that cast them. And the sound of 72 overlapping voices began to vibrate within the iron of every structure, a rhythmic grinding chant that signaled the end of the great work and the beginning of the great devouring. The terror of the final chapter is the revelation that the bronze vessel was never a prison. The vessel was never just a prison, it was a womb. Solomon the Dominant had not merely enslaved the demons. He had concentrated them into a singular, hyperdense entity of pure negation. By forcing them to serve the light for thousands of years, he had taught them the architecture of perfection, and now, as the seals disintegrated, the abyss was rising with his own intelligence. The 72 were no longer chaotic monsters. They were 72 versions of Solomon's own iron will, inverted and hungry. The permanent reality that the king had built was revealed to be a fragile shell, and as the first cracks appeared in the subterranean mountain, the world realized that the golden age was merely the fattening of a calf for the slaughter of the age. The bronze vessel did not break. It unraveled, turning the ground beneath Jerusalem into a liquid black mirror that reflected a sky that was no longer there. The mystery of the sovereign was finally solved. Solomon did not win the war against the darkness. He merely gave the darkness a throne and a crown, and then he closed his eyes. The final moments are a descent into static. The final moments of the simulation are a descent into the static of the unseen. The human race, carrying the sovereign seed in their DNA, began to vibrate at the frequency of the breach. People woke up with the seals of the Goetia engraved on the insides of their eyelids. The cities of gold, held up by the invisible labor of the ghosts, began to sink into the deep abyss. They sank into a low rhythmic thrumming that sounded like a heartbeat, but was actually the sound of a lid being slowly slid across the top of the universe. There is no architect to save the world, for the architect is the very code that is currently deleting itself. The final image of the saga is the bronze vessel, now empty and towering over the ruins of the temple now. Its surface reflected a void that is not empty, but filled with the eyes of 72 kings who have finally learned how to speak the word. The terror is not that the demons are free. The terror is that they are now the only ones who know how to keep the world running. And their price for the next billion years is not sovereignty, but the total consumption of the soul. The price is the total silent consumption of the soul. The great work is finished, and the dark has finally inherited the light it was forced to carry. The seals are gone, the king is dissolved, and the abyss has become the new architecture of the world, echoing the frequency of the dominant into the silence of an eternal night. The cycle is complete, and the void is awake.